The second book in the Resonance Tetralogy, Fracture continues the adventures of Faria and her friends in the world of Eeres. Picking up shortly after the first left off, we return to a city damaged by the Draken assault. Set months after the first book in the aftermath of the violent attack by the Draka, we once again return to the fantasy world of Eeres and the kingdom of Zayal, still recovering from its wounds. The second book is largely based around characters that didn't get a lot of screen time in the first installment, notably Bayer, Faria's protector, and Captain Alaris, a pangolin soldier from the neighboring Andarn. Together they travel to carry out a mission whose consequences may spell disaster for the entire continent. Bayer spends much of the book struggling to find his purpose in a world turned upside down, a position I think most of us can appreciate. While wanting to be useful, he does not know how he fits in the aftermath of all that has happened. I found him to be a loyal and brave character who is exactly the sort of person you want watching your back, whether he's with you physically or not. As for Alaris, he is perhaps the first pangolin character I think I've ever encountered in furry fiction, at least so far. I appreciate his creative interpretation of his orders early in the book, and he definitely strikes me as a skilled military leader, one who knows what's in the best interest of the nation, and not just following his orders without question. With their wounds tended to and the threat gone, Zayal begins the slow process of reconstruction in the aftermath of the revelations wrought by Faria's father. With the help of the nation of Andarn, the city begins its slow journey back towards normality, but not all is as it seems. Left with little to do and still recovering from his injuries, Bayer finds himself without purpose. When a counselor from Andarn is murdered, he escorts Captain Alaris on a mission to uncover the truth, with the price of their failure meaning war. The sequel to Legacy, Fracture, is the follow-up to the fantasy epic written by Hugo Jackson. I always enjoy Hugo's books as they're usually filled with interesting characters and exciting battles you can almost see in your imagination. For the most part, I wouldn't really characterize it as a direct sequel, but more of a follow-up that goes in a slightly different direction. Now, I don't know if that was the intention, but I suspect based on the pattern so far that perhaps Book 3 will follow Osiris as a main character with a journey to Skyria. Whether that pattern holds, I'll find out when I examine the next book. In Fracture, we find ourselves deeply embedded in a mystery that begins with the first pages and a sudden murder to which we scarcely know what's going on. In its aftermath, we return to the familiar if a bit damaged setting of Zayal, where we catch up with our characters after the violent attack in the previous book. One thing the author does very well is create strong characters that have motivations you can feel. Largely absent from the first book, we can tell that Bayer is finding himself somewhat without purpose in the days following Faria's return. With his role as protector now occupied by Kairu and Eren, he has little to do with his sovereign and Faria's father now gone. When given a task by Captain Alaris at the nation of Andarn, he goes along. Returning to his former residence of Kurik, he discovers far more is going on than he anticipated. First, the positives. Hugo's characters are fleshed out, three-dimensional individuals whose personalities show very well throughout the narrative. I can really feel the bond between the characters and their own personal struggles. I'd also say that the descriptions are vivid and full of literary flavor. Although this is going to sound like a criticism, I have to say that for me personally, it was a bit harder for me to follow than the previous book. The author told me it was not as linear as the first, but I don't really know if I'd say that was the issue. Now, I do want to reiterate that it was a very enjoyable book that I would absolutely recommend to fans of the series and the fantasy genre overall, not to mention the amazing cover really just provides a beautiful introduction to the book's main characters. Where I feel that Fracture suffers is from a slight disconnect between the conspiracy that begins the book and the rest of the material. While we see a murder early on, I don't feel that it was really given the proper context in the subsequent chapters. It is mentioned by the other characters, and it gets Captain Alaris sent home, but these events to me at least felt somewhat distant, and not a direct cause of any of the early events of the novel. What I think would have served the book better is for Faria to have had a more central role in the sequel, stepping into her role as a statesman or statesperson. I feel that the early chapters should have had Faria attempting to argue for her sovereign on the Senate floor, asking for aid and arguing for their continued independence. Coupled with the backdrop of the murder, I think Bayer should have been investigating it, and that in turn should have led him to the events in Kurik later in the book. While Osiris and Maka take Tyrenin to Skyria, Eren and Kairu would remain with Faria in the capital while the conspiracy takes shape. With most of the events setting up the conspiracy seen in isolation, with none of our main cast aware of or directly affected by them, it makes it difficult to connect cause and effect until close to the book's conclusion. And while I do agree that you don't want to give away too much too early, it's important that these events are grounded in the rest of the plot so that we know as the audience how they play out, even if the POV characters do not. Overall, I found the book very enjoyable and I absolutely recommend it without reservation.
Thanks for watching, and if you liked it, click the subscribe button and leave a comment below. You can also find me on Twitter and a few other places on the web, or support me via Patreon or Ko-fi. Zebra hugs!